The night my parents decided to mock me felt like any other family party. Too loud, too bright, and designed to remind me exactly where I ranked. I stood in the kitchen with an apron tied tight, scrubbing a pan that was already clean, while laughter rolled in from the living room like it belonged to another life. My mother's voice floated over the noise, sharp and amused. She told the guests not to distract me, said this was my job now, and they laughed like it was clever. I had moved back home after being laid off. Not fired. Laid off. The difference mattered to me, but in that house it meant nothing. To my parents, jobless meant useless. To my brother, it meant I was a joke that came with free content. He leaned in the doorway with his phone raised, telling me to smile because the live-in maid was shy. I kept my eyes down. I had learned that reacting only made it worse. The party was for my cousin's engagement. White balloons, catered food I helped prepare, but wasn't invited to sit and eat. Every time I stepped out to refill drinks, someone had a comment ready. Still looking? Must be nice, no responsibilities. At least you're helpful here. Helpful became the word they used to keep me small. At one point, my father tapped his glass for attention. He wrapped an arm around my mother and spoke like he was giving a speech he'd practiced. He said family was about contribution, that everyone played their part, that some people earned and some people served. His eyes drifted toward me without saying my name. I felt my face burn, but I didn't speak. Months earlier, when I packed my desk into a cardboard box and walked out of my old office, I had promised myself I would never explain my worth to people who enjoyed misunderstanding me. So I served. Quietly. Patiently. What none of them knew was that my layoff hadn't ended my career. It had rerouted it. While they slept, I worked. I sent proposals, rewrote pitches, studied contracts, absorbed rejections without announcing them. I learned when to be silent and when to sharpen my work. I didn't share progress. I let it grow where no one could trample it. Halfway through the party, my mother snapped her fingers and told me to bring dessert, reminding me to clean the counter first because guests were watching. Guests were always watching. They just never really saw me. As I carried plates, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it at first, then it buzzed again, then a third time. I slipped back into the kitchen, annoyed at myself for hoping. My hands started to shake when I saw the subject line of the email. Contract approval. Final signature. I opened it and read the number slowly, carefully, as if it might vanish if I rushed. $240,000. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a miracle. It was 6 months of quiet work finally choosing me back. I leaned against the counter and breathed while laughter spilled from the other room. My brother was bragging about his promotion. My mother laughed too loudly. My father sounded proud. They had no idea what had just changed. I didn't run out there. I finished plating dessert. I wiped the counter. I walked back into the room like nothing had happened. My mother whispered that I'd fall apart without them. I smiled because the timing was perfect. My phone buzzed again. A call this time. The CEO. I answered and said yes, I was available. His voice was calm and respectful as he congratulated me and explained next steps, including when the first payment would be sent. When I hung up, the room felt different. My father asked who I was talking to. I said work, and people laughed. They stopped laughing when I didn't. My brother asked what kind of work. I said consulting. My father scoffed and asked if that meant folding napkins. I looked at him and told him it was strategy and systems, the kind of work he said wasn't real. My mother told me not to joke in front of guests. Someone asked how much. I didn't answer right away. My father filled the space, saying if it were serious, they'd know. I read the number straight from the email. $240,000. Initial contract. Renewable. The room went silent. Forks paused mid-air. My brother's face drained of color. My mother gripped the table. My father laughed once, short and nervous, and said it wasn't funny. I told him that was why it was real. Suddenly, everyone wanted details. Who? How? Since when? My parents talked over each other, trying to step into the story now that it sounded impressive. I raised a hand and said I was still on probation, just like I had been in their house. My mother smiled tightly and said she'd always known I had potential. I told her she just didn't think it was worth respecting. The party never recovered. People congratulated me with curiosity and discomfort. I untied my apron and set it on a chair. My father started to say I didn't have to, but I told him I knew, and that I wouldn't anymore. That night, I packed a bag without anger. Just clarity. My mother hovered, unsure whether to apologize or remind me of everything they'd done. She asked if I was really leaving. I said yes. She said family mattered. I told her family didn't turn survival into a joke. Weeks later, the first payment landed in my account. Clean and undeniable. I moved into a small apartment filled with light and quiet. I bought a desk I chose myself. No one mocked me there. My parents called more often after that. Asked questions, offered advice, suggested investments. I listened without correcting them. At the next family gathering, I arrived as a guest. No apron, no chores. When my mother tried to hand me a dish, I smiled and passed it back. I told her I didn't work there. This time, no one laughed. After that night, something subtle shifted in the way my family spoke to me. Their voices softened. Their words became careful, like they were walking across thin ice they hadn't known was there before. Respect hadn't arrived yet, but fear had. Fear of being wrong. Fear of having underestimated me for too long. My parents started dropping hints instead of insults. My mother would casually mention how stressful the house felt without me around, how empty the kitchen seemed. My father asked questions about my work, not because he understood it, but because the number attached to it demanded attention. Every call felt less like concern and more like recalculation. I didn't rush to fill the silence I'd left behind. I let them feel it. My work consumed me in the best way. Meetings where my ideas were listened to. Emails that ended with thank you instead of demands. People who didn't need to diminish me to feel important. Every day I woke up knowing exactly why I was needed, and no one asked me to prove it with obedience. One afternoon, my mother called and told me they were hosting another family gathering, smaller this time. She said it carefully, like an invitation instead of an order. She asked if I would come. I said maybe. That single word unsettled her more than any argument ever had. When I did arrive, things were different. The seating had changed. The jokes had disappeared. My brother avoided eye contact, suddenly unsure of his place without me beneath him. My father introduced me to relatives using my name first, my work second, like both mattered now. I noticed what else had changed. No one handed me a plate to wash. No one asked me to help in the kitchen. My mother did it herself, glancing at me now and then, as if expecting me to step in. I didn't. At one point, a distant aunt asked if I could help clean up. The room went still. My father answered before I could. He said, "She's busy." Not busy that moment. Busy in life. I thanked him with a nod, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Later that night, my mother pulled me aside. She said she hadn't meant to hurt me before, that times were stressful, that they worried about me. Her words sounded practiced, but her eyes looked tired. I told her I understood stress. I told her what I didn't understand was cruelty disguised as motivation. She didn't argue. I left early. Progress didn't require my endurance anymore. Months passed. My contract renewed, then expanded. My calendar filled with opportunities my past self would have begged for. I hired help. I raised my rates. I learned the difference between being needed and being used. My family still tells the story of my success, but they tell it differently now. They say they supported me. They say they believed in me. I let them say it. I don't correct history that no longer controls me. What matters is this. I stopped shrinking to survive rooms that never planned to make space for me. I stopped working for approval and started working for alignment. And the night they mocked me into silence became the same night they lost the power to define me. They made me their maid when they thought I was nothing. They lost me when they realized I was everything without them. The distance didn't make us strangers, but it rewrote the rules. I no longer rushed to answer every call. I no longer explained every decision. When my parents spoke, I listened without shrinking. When they criticized, I didn't defend. I simply stayed still, and that stillness unsettled them more than any argument ever had. My work kept expanding in ways I hadn't expected. Referrals led to introductions. Introductions turned into rooms I was once told I didn't belong in. People asked for my opinion and waited for it. I learned how powerful that pause was, how different it felt from begging to be heard. One evening, my father called and asked if I could help him review something for his business. The request was hesitant, almost awkward. For a moment, I saw the man who had once dismissed my skills, now unsure of how to approach them. I agreed, but on my terms. Clear boundaries, clear expectations. He thanked me, and the gratitude sounded real, not performative. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. Not because I felt victorious, but because I felt finished. Finished needing them to see me a certain way. Finished replaying old scenes in my head and wishing I'd spoken louder. At the next family event, my brother finally tried to joke again, testing the old dynamic. It didn't land. No one laughed. He changed the subject. Power doesn't announce itself. It just rearranges the room. Later, he pulled me aside and said he hadn't realized how hard things had been for me. He didn't apologize directly. He didn't need to. His discomfort was enough proof that the hierarchy had collapsed. I realized then that revenge didn't look like shouting or public humiliation. It looked like calm. It looked like being unavailable for disrespect. It looked like walking away with your dignity intact and your future untouched. When people ask me now how I did it, I don't tell them about the party or the apron or the laughter. I tell them about the nights no one saw, the emails sent into silence, the patience it took to wait until my work spoke louder than my pain. Because the truth is, the contract didn't change me, it revealed me. And the people who once reduced me to nothing had to learn how small their voices sounded once I stopped listening. Time did what confrontation never could. It settled the noise. It clarified the truth. I stopped measuring my life by how my family reacted to it and started measuring it by how peaceful my days felt. Mornings became quiet rituals instead of anxiety drills. Coffee at my own desk. Sunlight instead of tension. Work that respected my time and rewarded my focus. My parents still tried, in subtle ways, to reclaim familiarity. My mother would send messages about recipes she thought I missed, memories she framed as warmth instead of control. My father forwarded articles about business, as if we were equals now, as if the past hadn't happened exactly the way it had. I replied politely, briefly, without reopening doors I had worked too hard to close. One afternoon, my mother asked if I ever felt lonely. The question wasn't about concern, it was about access. I told her no. I told her I finally felt settled. She didn't respond for a long time after that. As my work grew, so did my confidence in saying no. No to projects that drained me. No to conversations that circled old wounds. No to roles I had already escaped. Every no felt like reclaiming another inch of myself. At a larger family celebration months later, a distant relative praised my parents for raising me so well. I watched their faces carefully. For the first time, neither of them looked triumphant. They looked cautious. My success no longer belonged to them, and they knew it. My father tried to add something about discipline and tough love. I gently interrupted and said I had learned most of my resilience alone. The table went quiet, but no one challenged me. Truth doesn't need permission once it's earned. When the night ended, my mother hugged me longer than necessary. She whispered that she was proud of me. I believed she meant it. but I also knew it had come too late to change anything essential. Pride after survival feels different, softer, sadder. Driving home, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. Not because they had redeemed themselves, but because I had moved on without dragging them behind me. I didn't need them to regret what they did. I needed myself to stop reliving it. They once made me feel small in a room full of people. Now I walk into rooms where my presence is expected, my voice is valued, and my absence would be noticed. And that, quietly, is how the story ends. Even after everything settled, life kept offering small moments that reminded me how far I'd come. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet ones that used to feel impossible. Signing a lease without asking permission. Turning down invitations without guilt. Choosing rest without feeling lazy. These were victories no one clapped for, but they mattered more than the applause I never got at home. My parents adjusted the way people do when reality refuses to bend. They stopped teasing. Then they stopped advising. Eventually, they just listened. Not because they suddenly understood me, but because they finally realized I no longer needed their approval to move forward. That realization changed the balance more than money ever could. One evening, my mother admitted something she had never said out loud. She told me she had been afraid when I lost my job, afraid of what it would say about them, afraid of what others would think. She said turning me into the responsible one at home had made her feel in control. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't comfort her either. Understanding doesn't always require forgiveness. Sometimes it just requires honesty. I told her I had never needed control. I had needed trust. She nodded like that. Truth hurt more than anger ever could. After that, we spoke less, but better. Fewer words, clearer ones, no pretending, no rewriting the past. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something had broken and didn't need to be rebuilt the same way. My career kept growing, but it stopped being the centerpiece of my identity. It became support, not proof. I invested time in friendships that felt mutual, in routines that felt grounding, in a life that didn't need a dramatic backstory to justify its value. Sometimes late at night, I think about that party. The apron, the laughter, the moment my phone buzzed and everything changed. Not because I wish I could relive it, but because it reminds me of something important. They didn't lose me when the contract arrived. They lost me the moment they decided my silence meant weakness. And I found myself the second I stopped trying to correct them. After that, the memories stopped hurting and started teaching. I could think about that version of myself without wanting to rush in and save her. She had done exactly what she needed to do. She stayed quiet long enough to build something no one could take from her. I stopped telling my story like it was a wound and started carrying it like a credential. Not something I flashed, but something I knew was there. It shaped how I chose people, how quickly I trusted, how firmly I drew lines when something felt familiar in the wrong way. My parents eventually asked if I'd ever move back home. The question was careful, almost hopeful. I told them no. Not harshly, just honestly. I said I had built a life that fit me now, and I wasn't willing to shrink it to make anyone else comfortable. They didn't argue. Some answers closed doors gently. At work, I was invited into bigger conversations, decisions that affected entire teams. I noticed how often people thanked me for being calm under pressure. I smiled at that. Calm had once been mistaken for obedience. Now it was recognized as strength. Every so often, someone new would hear about my family and say how lucky I was to have such supportive parents. I learned not to correct them. I learned that peace doesn't come from being understood by everyone. It comes from understanding yourself well enough to let false versions of your story pass by without chasing them. On the anniversary of that party, I did something small. I folded an apron and placed it in a box with other things I no longer needed. Old notebooks, old fears, old names I had been called that were never mine to carry. I closed the lid and didn't look back, I don't hate my parents. I don't idolize them either. They are people who made choices, and those choices shaped the distance between us. Distance isn't punishment. It's protection. What I know now is simple and unshakable. The moment they reduced me to what I could do for them, they lost the right to define who I was becoming. And the moment I stopped proving myself to anyone but me, my life finally began to feel like my own. What surprised me most was how ordinary happiness felt once I stopped fighting for it. There was no rush, no dramatic reveal, no audience. Just days that flowed without knots in my chest. I woke up without bracing myself. I slept without replaying conversations. Peace didn't arrive like a reward. It arrived like something I'd been entitled to all along. My parents still existed in my life, but on the edges. Holiday messages, short calls, updates exchanged like weather reports. We no longer pretended closeness where there wasn't any, and in that honesty there was less damage. I stopped hoping they would suddenly become different people. Hope, I learned, can be a trap when it's placed in the wrong hands. Once my father said something that stayed with me. He admitted that when he saw me struggling, he felt powerless, and powerlessness made him cruel. He said he thought pressure would make me stronger. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him strength built in fear looks a lot like silence. Some realizations come too late to be useful, but not too late to be noted. I met people who never asked me to earn my place with them. Friends who didn't need me to explain my past to justify my present. They accepted the version of me that had already survived enough. With them, I laughed easily. With them, I rested. There are moments, even now, when someone underestimates me, when a tone feels familiar, when a joke cuts a little too close. I don't freeze anymore. I don't shrink. I simply step back. I let distance do the talking. The right people notice. The wrong ones fade. If there's a lesson hidden in all of this, it isn't about revenge or money or proving anyone wrong. It's about refusing to stay where your dignity is negotiable. It's about understanding that silence can be strategy. But staying silent forever is surrender. I didn't raise my voice that night. I raised my life, and nothing they ever said after that could reach me the way their laughter once did. Years from now, people will remember my success without remembering the struggle that shaped it. They'll see the results and assume confidence came naturally. That certainty was always there. They won't picture the nights I doubted myself in silence, or the mornings I swallowed humiliation just to keep moving forward. And that's fine. Some chapters aren't meant to be public. I've learned that growth doesn't always announce itself with dramatic change. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to attend a gathering that will cost you your peace. Sometimes it looks like ending a call early. Sometimes it looks like sitting alone and feeling content instead of restless. These are the choices that quietly rewrite your future. My parents still tell stories about me, but they tell them carefully now. They leave out the jokes. They skip the part where I was made small. I let them. Correction isn't my responsibility anymore. Healing doesn't require a shared version of events. Occasionally, my mother asks if I'm happy. The question sounds different now. Not curious, not controlling, just unsure. I tell her yes. Not because everything is perfect, but because my life finally belongs to me. That answer seems to settle something in her, even if she doesn't fully understand it. I no longer fantasize about confronting them or replaying that party with sharper words. The need to win an argument fades when you realize you've already won your freedom. Closure doesn't come from the past apologizing. It comes from the present no longer hurting. If I could speak to the version of myself standing in that kitchen, apron tied tight, hands raw from scrubbing, I wouldn't tell her to fight back. I'd tell her to keep going, to trust the quiet work, to know that dignity survives even when no one acknowledges it, because one day the laughter will stop, and when it does, you won't need revenge. You'll already be gone. Long after the story stopped being dramatic, it became something steadier. My life didn't revolve around proving anything anymore. It revolved around choosing well, choosing people who spoke to me with care, choosing work that challenged me without consuming me, choosing silence when noise offered nothing but old wounds dressed up as conversation. I noticed how my parents' pride came in waves now, rising whenever they could attach my success to themselves, fading when they realized it no longer gave them control. I didn't resent it. I understood it for what it was: recognition without ownership, approval without authority. There was a moment, quiet and unannounced, when I realized I no longer felt the need to check my phone after speaking to them. No tightness, no second guessing. That was when I knew the healing had settled in fully. Not loudly, permanently. I started mentoring others who were where I had been, people underestimated, people stuck in rooms that fed on their silence. I never told them to wait for revenge. I told them to build something so solid they wouldn't need it. I told them dignity compounds faster than anger ever could. Every now and then, someone from my family's circle would say, "We always knew you'd do well." I smiled politely. Knowing now didn't erase not knowing then. And I didn't need it to. What mattered was this: I had learned how to walk away without bitterness, how to succeed without cruelty, how to remember without reliving. I didn't become hardened. I became precise. The night they mocked me faded into memory, but the lesson stayed sharp. People will treat you according to the version of yourself you allow them to access. When you close certain doors, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, everything else rearranges itself naturally. I didn't leave to be admired. I left to be free. And freedom, once claimed, never asks for permission again. Eventually, even the need to tell the story faded. Not because it wasn't true, but because it no longer defined me. I stopped introducing myself through what I had survived and started letting people know me through what I chose. My days became fuller, not louder. Purpose replaced urgency. Confidence replaced defense. I realized something important about power. Real power doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't correct every lie. It doesn't chase respect. It simply changes access. The people who once spoke over me now waited for replies that didn't always come. The people who dismissed me now watched from a distance, unsure how to step back into a life they no longer controlled. My parents aged into a quieter version of themselves. Less sharp, less certain. Time softened them in places love never reached. I could see regret flicker sometimes, not dramatic enough to apologize, not brave enough to name. I didn't push. Regret, like growth, has to be self-discovered. There was one final moment that stayed with me. My mother once said, almost to herself, "You turned out stronger than we expected." I answered calmly, "I had to." She nodded, and for the first time, didn't try to explain herself after. That was enough. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement wrapped in warmth. I accepted truth wrapped in silence. I learned that closure doesn't always arrive as an apology. Sometimes it arrives as acceptance. Quiet, incomplete, but real. If someone were to look at my life now, they wouldn't see revenge. They'd see balance. They'd see boundaries. They'd see a woman who knows when to stay and when to leave. They wouldn't know how hard that wisdom was earned, and I wouldn't feel the need to tell them, because the greatest victory wasn't the contract, or the moment the room went silent, or the way power shifted overnight. It was this: I no longer live in reaction to who they tried to make me. I live in alignment with who I chose to become. There's a strange peace that comes when nothing is left to prove, when the urge to be seen fades, and what remains is simply being. I reached that place without ceremony, without applause, without even noticing at first. It arrived quietly, the way stability often does. I stopped explaining my choices to people who weren't affected by them. I stopped softening my boundaries so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. I stopped confusing familiarity with safety. These weren't dramatic shifts. They were small decisions, repeated until they became instinct. My parents and I found a rhythm that worked because it was honest, limited, real. No expectations of who I should be for them. No performances. Just occasional conversations that didn't reach too deep and didn't cut anymore. Distance didn't mean absence. It meant control over how much of myself I gave. I learned to recognize respect, not by how loudly it was offered, but by how consistently it was shown. By who listened without interrupting. By who didn't joke at my expense. By who didn't need me smaller to feel secure. Those became my people. Sometimes I catch myself smiling at ordinary things. A quiet evening, a solved problem, a message that says, "Thank you for your insight." And I remember how once, I thought happiness had to arrive dramatically to be real. Now I know better. Real happiness settles in and stays. The past doesn't haunt me anymore. It informs me. It reminds me why I trust slowly, why I value independence, why I never mock someone who is rebuilding. I know what that silence feels like. I know how heavy it can be. If my story has an ending, it's not one where everyone learns a lesson at the same time. It's one where I learned mine early enough to change the direction of my life. They once laughed while I stood alone in that kitchen. Now, I stand firmly in my own life, surrounded by choices I made for myself. And that's where the story truly rests. What remains now is not anger or pride, but understanding. Understanding that some people can only love you in ways that don't cost them power. Understanding that being underestimated can be painful, but it can also be protective. No one interferes with what they don't value, and that gave me the space to build without sabotage. I learned to notice how quickly people change their tone once your silence turns into results. How mockery softens into curiosity, and curiosity into respect. Not because hearts transformed, but because outcomes demand different behavior. That awareness made me careful about who I let close and why. There are days I still think about the version of me they thought they knew. The one they felt entitled to direct, to use, to belittle. I don't feel sad for her anymore. I feel grateful. She endured long enough for me to exist. My parents sometimes ask for advice now. Not often. Carefully. I give it when I want to, not when I feel obligated. Power feels different when it's chosen instead of seized. I no longer confuse endurance with loyalty. I no longer mistake tolerance for love. I no longer stay quiet in places where silence is mistaken for permission. Growth taught me that. If this story sounds calm at the end, it's because calm is the victory. Not loud success. Not public reversal. Just a life that doesn't require armor. They remember the night I stopped being useful to them. I remember the night I became free. And I carry that difference with me. Not as a scar, but as proof that no one gets to decide your worth just because you're temporarily quiet. Some people lose you slowly. Others lose you the moment they laugh. They chose their moment. I chose my future. At some point, even the echoes disappeared. The laughter, the silence, the tension. All of it faded into something distant, like a place I once lived but no longer needed directions to find. I stopped checking whether my success had reached them. I stopped wondering what they thought of me now. Curiosity about their perception dissolved when my own certainty became enough. I noticed how differently I moved through the world. Straighter, quieter. Not because I was afraid to speak, but because I no longer needed to fill space to be acknowledged. People met me where I stood or not at all. Either way, I was fine. There were moments when my parents tried to recreate closeness through nostalgia. Stories from my childhood. Memories edited to sound kinder than they were. I listened without correcting them. The past didn't need to be accurate anymore to lose its power. It only needed to stay there. I learned that boundaries don't always look like distance. Sometimes they look like neutrality. No anger. No hope. Just clarity. That was the hardest boundary to build and the easiest one to maintain. My life became something I protected, not something I explained. I chose privacy over validation. peace over performance. And in doing that, I finally understood what independence really meant. Not money, not status. The ability to walk away without shaking. If anyone ever asks me what changed everything, I don't mention the contract or the party or the silence that followed. I say I stopped negotiating with people who benefited from my doubt. I stopped shrinking so others could stay comfortable. They once needed me small to feel big. Now I don't fit in that room anymore, and I don't try to. Life moved forward in ways that didn't ask for permission from the past. New seasons replaced old ones without ceremony. New challenges arrived, not to break me, but to remind me that growth never really stops. It just changes its shape. I became careful with my energy. Not guarded, just intentional. I learned the difference between people who were curious about my life and people who were looking for a way back into control. Curiosity listened. Control questioned. I answered one and ignored the other. My parents' presence became symbolic rather than central. They were part of my story, not the authors of my future. When they spoke with pride, I accepted it without letting it rewrite history. When they stayed quiet, I didn't fill the gap. Silence no longer scared me. It felt familiar, manageable, neutral. Sometimes I wondered if they realized what they lost. Not access to my success, but access to me. The version that once waited for approval. The version that cleaned up emotional messes she didn't create. That version was gone, and she wasn't coming back. I stopped needing milestones to feel valid. No more waiting for the next win to justify my confidence. I trusted myself even on ordinary days, especially on ordinary days. That was the real shift. If someone had told me back then that peace would feel this steady, I wouldn't have believed them. I thought freedom had to roar. I thought self-worth had to be defended. I was wrong. The strongest things in my life arrived quietly and stayed without effort. They once mistook my patience for weakness. I mistook my endurance for obligation. Now, I know the difference, and knowing it changed everything. Time taught me the most important lessons after all the noise had faded. I discovered that resilience isn't just surviving insults or mockery. It's creating a life where those things no longer touch you. Strength isn't proving anyone wrong. It's refusing to be defined by them. Patience isn't waiting for recognition. It's learning to grow while the world watches without noticing. I became someone who could walk into any room without shrinking, without rehearsing a defense, without needing anyone to validate my presence. People respected me naturally because I had stopped asking for permission to exist fully. That quiet confidence changed more than any dramatic reveal ever could. Occasionally, my parents tried to reclaim fragments of influence, suggestions, reminders, well-meaning advice, but I had learned to filter them carefully. Some words I accepted, some I let slide. I no longer debated or explained. My boundaries were my own, clear and unshakable. I started mentoring others quietly, those who felt small, underestimated, or trapped in spaces that suffocated them. I never told them to seek revenge. I showed them how to build something so substantial that their worth couldn't be questioned, and that silence and patience could be more powerful than anger or confrontation. The apron, the laughter, the party, they existed only in memory now. No longer wounds, no longer triggers, just lessons. Lessons in patience, self-worth, and the subtle power of claiming your own life. They once needed me to be their maid. Now they only witness what I chose to become. And the difference isn't dramatic, but it's permanent. Eventually, even the memory of needing their approval lost its weight. I didn't think about the party, the laughter, or the apron anymore unless I was teaching someone how to survive a similar moment. The past became a reference, not a burden. I moved through the world lightly, carrying only what I had earned, not what they had assigned me. Success, money, recognition, they were never the point. The point was the freedom to make choices without someone else's judgment hanging over me. The point was the ability to sit quietly in a room and feel fully present, not performing or shrinking to fit anyone's expectations. My parents adjusted, reluctantly. Their pride became tentative, careful. They no longer assumed control, and I no longer assumed their understanding. Our interactions became transactional in the healthiest sense, civil, respectful, and limited to what mattered. No drama, no old roles replayed. I built friendships, work relationships, and routines that reinforced the version of myself I wanted to be. Every day, I reaffirmed that dignity is something you carry quietly, not something you demand from others. And in that quiet, I realized they lost me the moment they laughed at my silence. I found myself the moment I stopped shrinking to make them comfortable. Nothing else mattered.